Steve Brine.
Thank you very much, Mrs Moon. And it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady. I hope it won't be another 10 years before she makes a speech on this subject. But I really enjoyed her contribution and I found it very educational. So thank her for that. I also want to thank the Petitions Committee, who, as a minister who's sat in, a former minister who's sat in that place many times responding to Petition Committee debates, it's nice to be on the other side. But I want to thank them for bringing this forward, and to the just over 300 of my constituents who signed this petition. I think I know them all. I also want to thank the school children who also raised this with me in every school I go to, every school that I have visit here at the House, and to my own too, who raised this with me. And also to the Honourable Gentleman from Cambridge for the way that he set out the issue so clearly in, I think, his opening remarks today. I don't want to speak for long, Mrs Moon, you'll be pleased to know. I just want to make 3 brief points as my contribution, if I may. First of all, on the personal. As I have droned on to anybody who will listen, who's asked about this environmental area of policy since I was elected, this is the issue that got me here. This is the issue that got me to open my eyes as a schoolboy when I was no older than my 8-year-old son is now. I remember seeing the issue on television. I remember protesting at the television about the issue and my parents saying it's no good telling them, tell somebody else, do something about it. And that was what got me to open my eyes as an activist, and that is what got me to a lifetime of activism. That's what got me to join Friends of the Earth when I was a relatively young man, and ultimately to pursue a career in politics. And ever since I was adopted as the candidate for Winchester back in 2007, I have campaigned relentlessly under the Green Winchester umbrella on all sorts of issues. But I've always returned to this issue. I remember as a schoolboy writing articles, holding debates. I even wrote a poem for the school poetry competition on the subject, which the swines didn't let me win with, but there you go. And so it's an issue that I've always returned to. So, you know, while the rates of deforestation in the 80s, when I was at school, and continuing to the 90s, they were deeply troubling, and I guess they led to the sort of coverage on the television that caught my attention and raised my ire. It seems more recent years have given cause for hope in the Amazon. So yes, deforestation has been a concern in the region for some years, and I'm noting the excellent House of Commons Library briefing for this, that the New York Declaration published this year said that Brazil lost almost 55 million hectares of tree cover at a rate of this 5.7 soccer fields per minute. More than 84% of the loss occurred in the Amazon, an area bigger than Norway. But previous Brazilian governments have adopted a series of legal and administrative approaches aimed at reducing this, which led to a real decline in loss rates. So as the Declaration reports, the Amazon has long been held as a success story in global forest conservation efforts. In 2012, Brazil recorded its lowest deforestation rates in the last 20 years. It's a point worth repeating from the opening speech. And it's worth saying, because soy was raised in the previous contribution, that the world's first 2 large-scale voluntary commitments to reducing deforestation were based in the Amazon, namely the 2006 sector-wide soy moratorium and the 2009 company-specific cattle Brazil, forging public-private cooperation agreements. And nearly 50 companies have endorsed the soy moratorium, covering 90% of the soy trade in the Brazilian Amazon, while 18 of the country's 22 largest meat processors have committed to at least one of the cattle agreements. But I note that these approaches were successful, yet trends in slowing forest loss have been reversed in recent years. And in the period after 2012, deforestation has again increased, no doubt generating more young boys like me and young girls shouting at the television or outside in Westminster today. And the reversal in the trend towards slowing forest loss has been particularly acute this year, which is what worries us all so much, as the Declaration, the New York Declaration Progress Report, published in September of this year, says tree cover loss in the Amazon began to rise again in 2016 when it reached the 3.7 million hectares. While the rate of loss has fallen in the past 2 years, it's still higher than it had been since 2005. For the Amazon, deforestation rates continue to rise in the first part of this year, with an alarming 88% increase in June compared to the same month in the previous year. And I think it is worth repeating the point that my honourable friend raised earlier, that deforestation in Bolivia and Peru is also increasing. So it isn't just Brazil, but of course it is mainly. The other point, I mean, lots of points have been made about indigenous peoples and ecosystems, and I'm not going to repeat all of them, but as a former health minister and a former cancer minister, it is often said that the Amazon is the world's largest medicine cabinet, and it is a good point. Around 25% of all the drugs used today derive from rainforest plants. And the point that I always used to, one of the shouty TV moments for me was, you know, the logic suggests that on the balance of probability, if it's that high a percentage that we know that has come from the rainforest, what else is out there? You know, for those of us who fought and lost cancer as many times as I have and many have in this room, wouldn't it just be wonderful? Yes, if we could detect more cancers early, as is this government's ambition. But we're not going to do it for all, and we're going to need medicines and we're going to need drugs to treat them. And what is out there? That is, for me, the great question, is what else is out there? And my third point that I also want to talk to is about the response, because obviously that's what the petitioners are interested in. Now I understand President Bolsonaro's view on sovereignty, and of course, you know, international law would be on his side in respect of sovereignty of Islam. But I would argue that sovereignty of our planet is all of our sovereignty. And some 40 years later, from me being raised into political activism of some sort, we are still having this conversation. And what's worse, this conversation is getting more acute and more worrying because deforestation seems to be going in the wrong direction again. Now, I also understand the argument that we need to help Brazil trade its way out of this. And I thought that the point raised by my honourable friend from Far was very, very, very well made. And I listened acutely to what he said. He's visited the area many, many times. But, you know, it's often said that, you know, the Amazon basin has got a population living in poverty, and that is undoubtedly true. But most deforestation, a lot of deforestation, doesn't stem from poverty. And according to the federal government, 32.5% of deforestation in 2016 happened in big farms, and 24.5% in invaded public land, while 30% happened in smallholder agricultural land possessions, and 11% inside protected areas that allow for economic activities. So much of deforestation, especially in squatted land, is commissioned by people who don't live in the Amazon, which include gangs of land speculators and other forms of organised crime. So most of the big farmers and the land grabbers come from Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, Parana, and other southern states attracted by the cheap land and the low law enforcement that there is in Brazil. So I do understand that argument, but it worries me. On the response, around the G20 summit this year, obviously France and Ireland raised the prospect that they wouldn't ratify the huge trade deal with South American nations unless Brazil does more to fight fires in the Amazon. Now, French President Macron said that President Bolsonaro had lied to him about his stance on climate change. His words. Now, our Prime Minister called the fires that were raging in the Amazon at the time not only heartbreaking but an international crisis. We stand ready to provide whatever help we can to help them under control and to help protect one of the Earth's greatest wonders. And German Chancellor Merkel called the fire an acute emergency, shocking and threatening not only for Brazil and the other affected countries, but also for the whole world. I agree with all of those statements. But I would suggest that this deal, far from withdrawing from trade negotiations, I'm not arguing that we should withdraw from trade negotiations. I'm suggesting that the deal explicitly says that countries have to commit to tackling climate change, and therefore I would suggest that all we're asking is that the EU, of which we are still currently a member, hold Brazil to those commitments within that emerging agreement. And that seems perfectly reasonable to me. So, in closing, Mrs. Moon, I guess my point is that some 40 years on, we're still having this conversation. If we're still having this conversation in 40 years' time, it won't be a problem, it will be a bit of history. And it'll be a bit of history that's gone forever. And then those medicines that we may have found that may produce that cure for those terrible diseases that I've spent many hours in this Westminster Hall answering debates about and our constituents are affected by will not be found. And that seems to me like a stain on humanity if we let that happen. And it seems that, to me, the sovereignty point needs to be taken and balanced alongside that argument. So when the excellent Minister responds, who is a good friend, I would ask him to set out Her Majesty's Government's latest position on the EU-Mercosur trade deal, both as a member state and presumably from November the 1st as a former member state. Where do we stand? What leverage do we as a government propose to put onto Brazil and to those other neighbouring countries that have been mentioned? Because I won't be here in 40 years' time, but maybe my son will, and I really don't want him to be having the same argument that we are. Thank you.